Good morning. Turn in your Bible to 1 Samuel 23. 1 Samuel 23, and we'll pick up in verse 14 in just a moment. But I want to reiterate, if you're visiting, we're very glad that you're here. We want to welcome you into our assembly. And whether you're visiting or whether you've been here for a couple months or a couple years or maybe decades, I hope that what you find here is a family. I hope that you find brothers and sisters who strengthen and encourage you, people who are like family to you. And part of the reason why that's on my mind is because this past week, my family got into town, and so I've gotten to see them. Some of them got in late Wednesday night, and then more got in late last night, and they're all staying in Nashville, but they're going to be coming to, I think, the second hour for Bible class. So I hope that they'll get to meet you and interact with you and to meet some of the people that have already impacted me so much in just the short time that I've been here. So this week has been a very encouraging week for me because of those things, but also because I feel like this place is starting to feel more and more like home and more like family. That's what I've found in this place and with these people. And some of it is just like little things. There's a drawing that I don't know who it was, but some little kid ran up and handed it to me, and I didn't even get a chance to meet them. They ran off before I could even introduce myself to them. But some of it is just little things like that. But then the baptisms that we've had over the couple months that I've been here, getting to see have new brothers and sisters in Christ. But then just interacting with you, whether it's here or the few that I've gotten to be in your homes, I'm just very thankful that this is starting to feel more and more like family to me. And if you're visiting, I hope that that's what you find. But getting into the lesson, a key verse from last Sunday was 1 Samuel 23 and verse 14, where it says that Saul sought David every day, but the Lord did not give him into his hand. And this most certainly is not what David had in mind when Samuel anointed him to be king or when he slayed Goliath and won this great victory for Israel. But like many of God's promises, there's a period of waiting and testing as he positions us to receive it. And so like Jesus, who was anointed by the Spirit at his baptism and then went into the wilderness to be tempted for those 40 days in the wilderness. Now, David, after he is anointed, he goes into this period of waiting and testing. And the part where, the area, the region where a lot of this takes place is in a dry, arid, rocky kind of region called the wilderness or the desert of Ziph. And he's running all through this area, trying to flee from Saul, as Saul seems to always be at his heels. And you can imagine David's men in this moment. You can sort of imagine what they look like, covered in dirt and dust, and their lips are chapped and blistered from just the dry climate. And it's not like they have MREs or Lunchables to take with them. They're having to flee into this desert. And so rations are running low. And you wonder what was going through David's mind in a moment like this. Because we think of David as this mighty warrior king, and certainly he was that. But in this moment, on the inside, he is broken. And we get some idea of that in Psalm 13 when he says, "How long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long must I wrestle with my thoughts and day after day have this sorrow in my heart? How long will my enemy triumph over me?" So David, he's in this desert of distress, and he's confused, he's struggling, he's tired, and he's weary. And he's trying to understand God through all this. And as he's in this desert of distress, my guess is that everybody here this morning at least has some idea of what that's like. This desert of distress, these moments where everything seems to be going wrong. these moments where you're in a time of doubt and difficulty, and you're struggling to understand God. You're struggling to get by, and every day seems like a struggle. Every day you're fighting with some sin or temptation, but it keeps gaining ground. Every day you're trying to shake off the doubt and worry and depression, but you just can't seem to get loose. Or every day you're crying out to God to heal you or your loved one, and it seems to fall on deaf ears. Or maybe it's just the day-to-day life, the problems at work or in the home or at school, where these day-to-day things seem to mount up. And every day you try, but every day you feel like you're just about ready to give up. And you start to wonder that same question as David, right? How long? How long is this going to last? Because I'm not sure how much more I can take. And as we find David in this moment, and as we, at least in some way, can relate to this desert of distress, what is it that gets people through a time like this? What gets people through the trials and the testing and suffering in life? And I think people turn to all kinds of solutions, right? People turn to substances or different addictions, or maybe people just turn inward and they try to bear it up on their own shoulders, but none of that works. Because we've all tried that, right? We've all tried these other paths. We've all tried to find that way of escape in ourselves or in other things. And it's just like this mirage in the desert where you keep chasing after it, but the more that you do, the further and further it leads you away from where you need to be. And so what is it that got David through this time in his life? And I think part of the answer is what we looked at last week, right? It's the promises of God. That's what got David through. He trusted in the promises of God. He trusted that those many years ago when Samuel came and anointed him, that God would eventually bring this about. And so if we can just hold on to the promises of God, then we can make it. Because if we aren't holding on to God, then we are holding on to nothing. And so if we can hold on to that, then we can make it through. But isn't it also true that as we go through these times of testing, that our grip starts to loosen on the promises that we hold to so tightly? Throughout these times, throughout these trials, it becomes this burden. We get weary, and as we become more and more tired of this burden, as we struggle through, our grip starts to loosen on these promises, and what we need is for someone to come alongside us and to strengthen us and encourage us to keep holding on to those promises. And so pick up with me in verse 14 of 1 Samuel 23. It says there in 1 Samuel 23:14 that David remained in the strongholds in the wilderness, in the hill country of the wilderness or the desert of Ziph. And Saul sought him every day, but God did not give him into his hand. And David saw that Saul had come out to seek his life. And David was in the wilderness of Ziph at Horesh. And Jonathan, Saul's son, rose and went to David at Horesh and strengthened his hand in God. And he said to him, "Do not fear, for the hand of Saul my father will not find you. You will be king over Israel, and I shall be next to you. And Saul my father also knows this." And the two of them made a covenant before the Lord, and David remained at Horesh, and Jonathan went back to his home. All right, so in this desert of distress, what God has given us is not just the promises, but he's given us people. And that's why we're here this morning, right? We come because we believe in the promises of God. We believe that as we sang this morning, that our our hymns of praise are being lifted up to the creator of the universe. And we believe that when we pray, our God hears us, and that as we partake of the Lord's Supper, that he is in fellowship and in communion with us. We believe in those promises. But we keep coming back because we know that we just can't do this on our own. We need that encouragement. And I love that word encourage. You can hear in the word that Latin root core, meaning heart. And that's what the word means. It means to put heart back into somebody. And so it's more than just kind words or phrases that we might say. It's strengthening the very core of who they are. And so as we think about Jonathan this morning, what was it that made Jonathan that friend and brother to David? Because there's a verse that I think captures this scene, this moment so well, and it's Proverbs 17:17, where it says that a friend loves at all times and a brother is born for adversity. And if that has ever described anyone, that describes so well the character of Jonathan, a friend who loved at all times and a brother who was born for a moment like this. And so what was it that made Jonathan that friend and brother to David? And I think that as we see this, it'll be something that we can pick up on, that we can give to the people around us, because it's not just about finding a Jonathan, right? We can't really control that. We can't determine whether or not a Jonathan comes into our lives, but we can absolutely be a Jonathan and be that encourager to the people around us. It's not just that we want these kind of people in our lives, but we want to be these kind of people for the people in our lives. And so what was it that made Jonathan this person for David? And to look at that, I want to go back to where their relationship began, back in chapter 18. There in 1 Samuel chapter 18, this is right after David killed Goliath. And so he wins this great victory for Israel, and immediately he becomes this overnight sensation. Everybody loves David. And they even start singing that song, right? And it's not just a song sung by a few people. This spreads throughout the whole nation. People are singing this all over the place. It's the number one hit in Israel, that Saul has slain his thousands, but David his tens of thousands. And so everybody is praising and exalting David as this mighty warrior. And Saul even loves him at first, right? He takes him and he appoints him as a general or a captain in his army. And he sends him on all these special missions. And it says that God was with him everywhere he went. And he has this success. And so he gains more and more followers. He gains more and more popularity. And he is this celebrity among the nation. Everybody loves David. But as he is taken from the pasture and thrown into the palace, as Saul takes him from his home and never allows him to return back to Bethlehem, and he's in this new place, in this new environment, do you think that any of those people really cared about David? They only know him as David, the giant slayer. They don't know the kid from the pastures of Bethlehem. They only know him as David, the guy who can do something for me, and that's all they care about. In fact, some of these same people who are praising him and exalting him and joining in with the same song that everybody else is singing are the same people who will turn around and betray him. They'll become some of his worst rivals and his worst enemies in the years to come. And so as David is surrounded by all these people who see him just as this giant slayer and who don't know who he really is, notice verse 1. Chapter 18 and verse 1, it says, as soon as David finished speaking to Saul, the soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David. So David had just killed Goliath, but what Jonathan admired about David was not just what he did, but apparently it was something that he said. And so what was it that he said to to Saul? Well, it says in verse 58 of chapter 17, Saul said to him, "Whose son are you?" And David answered, and this is what Jonathan heard, "I am the son of your servant, Jesse the Bethlehemite." So what knit Jonathan to the soul of David was an understanding of who he really was. As he's taken from the pasture and thrown into the palace, Jonathan is the only person who really cares about his heart. He sees David as more than this mighty giant slayer. He knows the kid from the pasture. He knows the humble servant from that small town of Bethlehem. And I think what that shows is as we look at Jonathan, a true friend is the person who sees you for who you are. The kind of person who will come and find you in the desert of distress is the person who sees you for who you really are. I think that it's partly just human nature to sort of categorize people based upon our perception of them. We sort of base our perception based upon, external, superficial kinds of things. And it's like we take one angle or one stroke of a person's life and we paint a whole caricature out of it. And sometimes it's with small things. I remember when I got down to Florida College, it's kind of, a melting pot, people from all over the country. And so there's a lot of interesting stereotypes that are formed. And I remember when I got there, people, they find out you're from Texas, and it's like, oh, well, you must like ride a horse to school every day or something like that. And it's like, well, that would be really cool, but no, that's not actually it at all. And we do it with much more serious things than that. We take this one angle, we see people in just this one frame, and then never get to know the person behind that picture. But if we were to stop for just a moment and just really listen, what we find is that people are far more than our perception of them. People are more than the place that they're from, or the clothes they wear, or the house that they live in. People are more than the job that they have, or who they voted for, or what school they got into. People are more than their appearances. People are more than the sins or addictions that they might be struggling with. And here I think is an important one. People are more than their greatest success and more than their worst failure. Behind every high and low of a person's life that you might see, there's something more behind that. People are more than our perception of them because everybody has a story. Everybody has a story. And that's one of the things that I love about going to new places. You get to meet new people and you get to hear their story. And if we're ever going to be someone who can put heart into people, then we have to know their heart. We have to know who they really are. And so as we think about this, as we think about what it means to be an encourager and listening to these stories, that's what made Jonathan that friend and that brother to David. And sometimes that's all it takes, right? Sometimes all people need is for someone to just, for once, to really listen and to really try to understand who they are. And so that's where it starts. But there's another thing that I want to point out here, another observation from this text. If you look back at 1 Samuel 18, after Saul took David into the palace and he wouldn't let him return, it says in verse 3 that Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as his own soul. Now, the idea of a covenant, at least in the way it's used here, might seem a little bit foreign, a little bit distant to us. But it's the equivalent of someone saying, it's Jonathan coming alongside and saying, hey, I promise to be by your side. I promise that I'm going to be your friend. I'm vowing to uphold you and to be at your right hand no matter what. And Jonathan, he may have meant that in a very literal way because of what he does next. He says in verse 4, Jonathan, he took the robe that was on him and he gave it to David, and his armor and even his sword and his bow and his belt. So Jonathan, he takes the robe and the armor and the weapons that belong to him, and he hands them over to David. And this is huge because this is the king's son. This is the heir to the throne. And so if anyone had a right to be envious, to be a rival or an enemy to David, it was Jonathan. But instead, he takes the very things that mark his kingship and mark his royalty and position in the nation, and he gives it all over to David and says, no, you're going to be the king. And I'm here to serve you, and I'm going to be at your right hand. And so I think the point that I want to pull out from this is that what it means to be a true friend is not just someone who sees you for who you are, but someone who sets you above themselves. They set you above themselves. I think one of the biggest struggles today, or maybe just throughout time, I guess it's another thing that's just a part of us, is the problem of comparison. Where we view people either as resources and think, how can I take from them to get the things that I want or to get to where I want to be, or as rivals. How can I take them down? How can I move them down a couple notches to get to where I want to be? Because it's not enough to just be content with what I have or equal with what you have. I've got to find some way to be on top, to be better in whatever way that it might be. And that was the problem with Saul, right? He viewed David as this resource, and he took from him. And when he realized that he couldn't take from him anymore, he viewed him as this rival that needed to be taken down. And that could have just as easily been Jonathan, but instead, Jonathan, he's literally the guy who gives him the shirt off his back. And it reminds me of a drawing I saw a while back of, it was a drawing of a father and a son. And they were sort of sketched out of these bricks. And the father, he was taking bricks from himself and using them to build up his son. And that's what I see Jonathan doing here. He's taking from himself. He's taking from the most important, the most significant things about who he is and using them to build David up into the throne where he belonged. He builds David up. And it's like what Paul talks about in Philippians 2 about how we look out not for our own interests. It's not about me. It's not looking out for my own interests, but he says for the interests of others. And he even takes it a step further. He says there in Philippians 2 and verse 3, do nothing from selfish ambition or empty conceit, but in humility of mind, count others, what does he say, as equal to yourself? Count others as resources or rivals to you, as people to compare yourself with. No, he says, count others more important than you. And I read that verse and I think, maybe we're kind people, maybe we're polite and we do things for the people, but are we really the kind of people who consider everybody else as more important than me? Every room I walk in, every place I go, I'm last. Everybody else more important. Not building ourselves up into something great, but taking from ourselves, taking from our time and our resources, taking from the things that mean the most to us to build up the people around us. Tearing ourselves down if that's what it takes to build up others. To build up the people here, to build up the people in this community and in the world around us. Building others up. But there's one more thing I want to note, and to see that in Jonathan, I want us to turn back to 1 Samuel 23. in 1 Samuel 23, we're fast forwarding a couple years here, and David, he's been on the run for a while. He started up in Gibeah of Benjamin, and he's made his way down to the lower parts of this desert in this wilderness of Ziph, and he's tired, and his men are just beat, and he feels like he's on his last leg. And that's the moment where Jonathan finds him. And I want to emphasize that Jonathan, he leaves his father's side to come and find David in his greatest point of need. And so imagine what this brief reunion looked like. I kind of imagine David seeing him off in the distance and running over to him with tears in his eyes as they embrace each other. And it's just what David needed at just the right time. But whatever it was brief. Jonathan has to go, but before he goes, he says in verse 16 that he strengthened his hand in God. He strengthened his hand in God. And we looked at that phrase earlier, but what all does that mean? Surely just David's presence alone helped, right? Sometimes all it takes is a visit or a phone call or a letter from somebody to keep you moving forward. But notice what it is that he says here. Because I think it's in these words that we find what it really means to strengthen the people around us. He says, first of all, in verse 17, do not fear. Has anybody ever said those words to you? Don't be afraid, it's all right. And depending on who it is, those words may or may not have been helpful to you. And it seems like the encouragement, the strength that the world gives is they either elevate the person or they downplay whatever it is that they're going through. And so we might say things like, hey, do not fear because you've got what it takes. You have the strength. You can bear this on your shoulders. You can do it. And it's all about pumping up that person, elevating them. Or if we don't do that, we might downplay the situation. We might say, don't be afraid because it's not actually that bad. You've been through worse things before. It's going to be all right. It's not going to be that bad. And it's like maybe sometimes that's helpful. But what we have is something that's so much more powerful than that. Because what we do is we see people for who they are. We set them above ourselves. But what we have more than anything else is we have the strength in the Lord to give to the people around us. And so look at what Jonathan says here. He says, do not fear, my Father will not find you. So the first thing that Jonathan points to is God's deliverance. He's saying, I don't know how long this is going to take. I don't know exactly how God is going to deliver you or how long or arduous this might be, but I know that God will deliver you in this moment. And that's the encouragement that we can give to people today. That no matter what it is you're going through, no matter how dark and difficult it might be, God can deliver you from this. And it might take a long time. It might take many nights in prayer. It might be a struggle and a fight for a long time. But God can deliver you. You can find strength in the Lord. But then he also says this. He says, do not fear, my Father will not find you, and you shall be king. So not only does he focus on God's deliverance, but on God's purpose. He strengthens David by reminding him of the plan and the purpose that God has for his life. He's saying that God is going to raise you up as the king. And it might be months from now, it might be years from now. But even through this time, God is making you, he's molding you and shaping you into the king that he wants you to become. And that's something powerful that we can give to people today. We can say to them that even through a time like this, God is doing something. Seeing people not just for who they are, but who they can become. Motivating them toward their greatest potential in God, even when they feel like giving up. It's sort of like what Paul says in 2 Corinthians 4 about how we have this treasure in jars of clay. And I love that image, these jars of clay, because that's all we are. Like David from the pasture, we're not many wise, we're not many noble or mighty. But as these clay jars, he says, we, just like David, are hard pressed on every side, but not crushed. We're perplexed, but not in despair. We're persecuted, but not abandoned. We're struck down, but not destroyed. And so he says there in verse 16, we do not lose heart. Though the outer self is wasting away, the inner self is being renewed day by day. For this light, momentary affliction is preparing us for an eternal weight of glory beyond all comparison. So it's not just that we're stranded in this desert waiting it out for God's deliverance. It's that God right now is working in us. That even in this moment, even in this desert of distress, or maybe especially in this desert of distress, God is at work. Because like a potter working with clay, this is the moment, this is the time where God is molding and shaping and strengthening us into who he wants us to become. To will and to work for his good purpose, just like it was for David. And so that's the strength, that's the encouragement that we can give to people. The strength of knowing that God will deliver you and that God has a purpose. But then he says one more thing that I want to note here. And that's when he says, do not fear. My Father will not find you. You shall be king, and I will be next to you. I'll be next to you. And these words, I think, are so powerful, but so sad. And they're powerful because it shows just the sincerity and how true and genuine of a friend that Jonathan was to David. That he comes to him in this desert of distress and he says, I'm going to be at your right hand, and when you become king, I'm still going to be next to you, and I'm going to be right by your side every step of the way. And sometimes that's what we need more than anything else, right? We just need to know that somebody's next to us, that we're not in this alone. And so it's this powerful moment, but it's also sad because this is the last time that they would ever see each other. These are the last words that David ever heard from Jonathan. That you're going to be king and I'm going to be next to you. And you can see in that the dreams and the aspirations that they had as servants of God. The aspirations, the hopes that they shared for God's people and for God's kingdom and what they wanted to accomplish. But that same day where Saul fell on his own sword, Jonathan was slain in the same battle. And when word finally reached David, he wrote this song of lament to be sung by all Israel. And just listen to the words that he says about his friend and his brother. He says, how the mighty have fallen in the midst of battle. Jonathan, the glory of Israel, lies slain on the high places. I am distressed for you, my brother Jonathan, for you were very dear to me. Your love toward me was extraordinary, deeper than the love of women. How the mighty have fallen. Throughout this past week, I couldn't help but wonder as I was reading through this story and thinking about this relationship with Jonathan and David, of what it would have been like if Jonathan had lived to be at his right hand. All the victories that they would have won. Maybe Jonathan could have saved him from a few of the big mistakes that he'll go on to make in his life. And I guess we could never know, and I'm sure that God had a reason for doing this, but I think what we do know is that if it weren't for this time in the desert, David would not have been the king and the leader and servant that God had called him to be. And maybe even more than that, if it weren't for Jonathan, if it weren't for that friend and brother, then David would have never been the man who God had called him to become. Jonathan was that friend who loved at all times, and that brother born for adversity. One final point just as we close here. I think sometimes even in a world that is so full of people, we can feel alone and isolated and friendless. And I hope that as you're here that what you find here are people all around us who are like Jonathan. People who are that friend and that brother to you, because I believe that that's what God has called every one of us to be, and I genuinely believe that that's who we all want to be. We want to be these encouragers. We want to put heart back into the people here, into the people around us. And so I hope that you find that here, but I want to remind us of one last thing this morning, that we do have a friend who left the Father's side to come and to find us in the desert of distress when we needed him most. A friend who had every right to see us as a rival and an enemy, but who chose to see something more in us, to see something redeemable when we probably couldn't even see it ourselves. A friend who set us above himself, who gave of himself, who gave up his kingship and his authority, who gave us his own armor, who gave up his very life to set us above himself, to show us that greater love has no one than this, than to lay down his life for his friends. And a friend who strengthens us, not with empty words, not with a wish or a hope about what could be, but with a promise, with a guarantee proven by his resurrection that, lo, I am with you always, even to the end of the age. What a friend we have in Jesus. Our friend and our brother, even though he is our King. And if Jesus so loved us, then we also ought to love and strengthen and encourage one another. And not just the people in this room, not just the people of this church, or the people who are like us, but all the people in this world who are broken and distressed and so in need of a friend like Jonathan, and so in need of the friend that we have in Jesus, our King and our Savior. If you're here this morning and you're not a Christian, then you don't have that friend, you don't have that person who can get you through the desert of distress. And he's calling out to you. He's seeking you in the wilderness to bring you back. Or if you've wandered away and you are feeling weary and tired and you just need the prayers of this people, you just need the prayers of these people to strengthen the hands that are weak and the knees that are feeble, then we can do that. We can pray for you and we can lift you up. We can build you up in the Lord. Whatever it is that it might be, however we can help,